It is a pretty commonly accepted worldview to believe that drugs are bad and people who use them are morally deficient. But have you ever stopped to wonder where that even came from? While things like drinking wine are perfectly acceptable despite health risks and increased violence and drunk driving related deaths, it's because of drug war propaganda. Many don't know that substances like opioids, meth, and cocaine, when considering regulated versions of these drugs, are equally, if not less harmful than alcohol. Human beings have been using psychoactive substances for healing, ritual, labor, pleasure, and survival for as long as we've existed. And substance use wasn't some massive social problem until about a century ago, when governments realized that they could use drugs as a justification to control, criminalize, and surveil Black and brown populations. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the drug war has always, even prior to the Reagan and Nixon eras, been about targeting racialized people, never actually about drugs themselves. In the early 20th century, drugs like cocaine and heroin were being openly marketed to white Christians for medicine. For example, cocaine for toothaches, heroin for coughs, and amphetamines for energy and image enhancing and productivity. And simultaneously, Black and brown people were being criminalized for using and distributing the very same substances. There was little evidence to support these claims. It was largely accepted because of white supremacist notions of purity, and of course the propaganda, like that of today, only reinforced the fear amongst white Christian people of the Western world, right? So drug prohibition didn't emerge because substances suddenly became this evil and uncontrollable, dangerous entity. It emerged because drugs became a convenient excuse to target racialized communities and poor people and migrants and anybody really considered disposable at the time. I want to pause for a minute and share something that a Blackfoot elder and knowledge keeper once said to me. She said, in reference to people on the street and people shooting up in the alleys, she said, they're the true warriors because they have seen and experienced unspeakable things and they are still here. It disrupts the way that we're taught to see people who use drugs, not as broken or weak, but as people who have endured more than most systems could ever acknowledge. And here's the part that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Unregulated drugs keep a lot of people alive. I was one of those people. For those who don't know, I spent 10 years as a street-engaged drug user in the downtown east side. I tried meth for the very first time right before my 13th birthday. I was already precariously housed at this time. So I spent many years, most of my youth, in and out of jails because I was criminalized for survival and for my substance use. Right after I started using meth, it didn't stop. I experienced extreme harm during that period of my life. But the overwhelming majority of that harm didn't come from the drugs themselves. It came from poverty, from stigma, from criminalization, from being socially excluded, from having to perform moral purity and worthiness just to get my basic needs met, like housing, safety, and care. And something that we don't acknowledge enough because it is literally taboo. If I didn't have access to drugs, the crystal meth, other substances, I wouldn't have been able to survive and endure some of the horrific things that I had experienced. I witnessed a street brother murdered at 13, right? I ended up getting held hostage at one point. I literally witnessed and endured things that people couldn't even wrap their heads around. And because I was so young, a lot of the times I was at the mercy of unsafe men. Until you have been in a situation like that, you will never understand what that statement means. Crystal meth was a lifesaver. So given what I went through, using drugs wasn't irrational or deviant at all. It was a completely and understandable response to trauma, instability, and survival under impossible conditions. Right? And as things escalated, it became clearer and clearer that the deeper harm wasn't actually individual behavior at all. It was prohibition itself. There are things that happened to me that I will never speak of again. This is how prohibition works. It turns substances into evil, it turns users into problems, and then punishment starts to look like protection, right? All of those things that I mentioned that happened to me also weren't because of drugs themselves. It was because it was unsafe for me to access safe places under the prohibitionist expectations. Those horrific things where I felt no other choice but to put myself in danger wouldn't have happened. We stop asking why the supply is poisoned. We stop asking why people are in pain. We stop asking why housing, income, safety, basic human needs are literally withheld unless somebody proves that they're deserving. We tell ourselves that we're progressive, and then we end up supporting forced treatment and surveillance and compliance as long as it's wrapped in the language of care. And when we do this, we miss opportunity to understand each other's stories of survival and ingenuity. Because contrary to common beliefs about substance use, responsible parents who use drugs exist. People who use drugs know how to dose. They know how to keep each other safe and alive. And everything that we know about harm reduction today exists because of the labor of racialized, queer, and disabled drug users. But there is no overdose crisis without prohibition. People aren't dying because they use drugs. They're dying because the supply is poisoned. The iron law of prohibition says that as long as punitive drug laws exist, the market will only become more lethal, violence will only continue and get worse, and people will continue to die. And until we stop treating drug use as a moral failure instead of a human reality, until we stop infantilizing and surveilling drug users, thinking that we know best, we're just going to continue reinventing the drug war over and over and over again.